soirée. Bonsoir, buenas noches. Je vais essayer de vous laisser reprendre un petit peu vos esprits après.
Good evening. I'll give you just a few minutes to recover from such a strong emotional film. It is a fiction, but it's based on reality.
Une réalité complexe.
It was, of course, a very complex reality that we're going to try to unpick during this discussion. And of course, the main subject for this discussion is how to make that transition from war to peace in a country that's been affected by conflict for so many decades, and how to build a lasting peace. I'd like to thank the festival and its organizers for this opportunity to talk about peace in a faraway country like Colombia, but which we can draw a lot of lessons from for such a difficult time for Europe itself. Allow me to introduce our guests.
Processus de paix et du processus de réconciliation colombien.
Some of whom are key actors in this transitional period for peace in Colombia. Berta Lucia Frias, and then I'll talk Spanish so that I can talk directly with them. Rodrigo Londoño, please give them a round of applause because they've come all the way from Colombia.
Donc nous avons avec nous Berta Lucia Frias.
So we have Berta Lucia Frias, who represents victims.
Rodrigo Londoño, qui est le dernier.
And I'll tell you a bit more about that in due course. Rodrigo Londoño, a former commander of FARC, and Sergio Jaramillo,
qui était le négociateur.
Who was the negotiator of the peace agreements in Colombia. He negotiated for 7 years.
Et donc je continue en espagnol.
And allow me to continue in Spanish. So allow me to introduce our guests, Berta Lucia Frias. I'll just let her take a seat.
Berta Lucia, siéntase. Bienvenida, bienvenidos.
Welcome to all three of you. And thank you so much for coming. These are three very brave and courageous people. And I say that because making peace and building peace and reconciliation is much more difficult than waging war. And they are, I think, three examples for Colombia and indeed for the international community. Berta Lucia, you're from the business world, an entrepreneur, and in 2003 you were in Bogota in the El Nogal Club, an emblematic place for a lot of the upper classes in Bogota, when the bomb struck. And it was the biggest attack in an urban area committed by the FARC. There were 128 injured and 36 deaths. And you survived, but you were injured, and you almost finished paraplegic. You spent a long time in hospital, but you recovered, and you've since been working for peace and reconciliation. You've been working with former combatants, with former soldiers as well, trying to build a sustainable peace. And you continue to work tirelessly. And I'd just like to say that, you've said that all Colombians are victims. I'm not Colombian myself, but I did live there for many years.
Y también con el Consejo de Paz.
Now, you worked with the
a
Peace Council, and it's not the first time that you've met Sergio and Rodrigo.
Pero yo creo que es la primera.
You've met each other on a number of occasions, but I think this is the first time. It's a global first that you meet in a panel outside of Colombia with an international audience to talk about peace. Now, turning to Rodrigo Londoño, the last chief commander of FARC, who talked with President Juan Manuel Santos in 2005, which was a historic milestone for Colombia, of course. And then you negotiated and signed the peace agreement of the 4th of November 2006. There were two peace agreements,
Del contexto más tarde
and
y
we'll talk a
después.
little bit more about that later. And then the final peace agreement in November 2016.
También, Rodrigo, ustedes tienen
Rodrigo, you are a doctor by training, and you went into the guerrilla
Fui
when
comandante en
you
jefe
were
de
17 years old. Since 2011, you were commander-in-chief, and
Acuerdo de Paz
then you were
contra vientos y mareos
peace agreement against all odds.
de la
You
ley.
stigmatized by the former combatants. You were struck by the very slow implementation of the peace agreement, and the fact that many important key commanders in that process, for many different reasons, decided to go back into the forest and continue.
Y hoy en día, Rodrigo, usted es presidente
Now, Rodrigo, you are president of the new
de las FARC.
Comunes political group, which emerged from FARC.
Usted ha sido el alto comisionado para la
Sergio, you were High Commissioner of Peace under the Juan Manuel Santos government. From
2017. Usted pasó 7 años de su vida.
You spent 7 years, I think, day and night, trying to negotiate and gradually building that peace agreement. Of course, before it became an agreement, you had to negotiate in Colombia and outside of Colombia, with secret negotiations and public ones. You're also a philosopher, a Greek and security expert.
Puestos de funcionarios en el Ministerio de Defensa.
Roles in the Ministry of Defense, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia. You live in Europe, in Brussels, now, where you've been a Colombian ambassador, and you're now working as an expert at the European Peace Institute. So these are our 3 guests for tonight. And in this discussion, we'll be talking about peace building and the path to reconciliation. And we'll talk about 3 key dates in 2008, which you saw in this film, 2016, when the peace agreement was signed, and 2022, 5.5 years later. Of course, you can take the floor whenever you like. It's going to be a very fluid discussion. It's not a conference or a lecture. And then we'll turn to the public for questions and answers.
Yo quería hacer como un pequeño resumen de lo que es
I just wanted to try to sum up the situation in Colombia. It's a very complex country, of course, and sometimes very difficult to explain. But we're going to try to hear from our guests in a moment. But first of all, allow me to give you a few facts. It's a country that's trying to emerge from a war which lasted so long, over several generations. In 2016, the peace agreement was signed, recognized by all of the international community, signed between FARC and the government of Juan Manuel Santos. It was a very ambitious agreement with the with the ambition to transform the country. And it unfortunately remains one of the most unequal countries on the American continent. Peace is not comprehensive. There are other armed groups who remain in Colombia, and the Colombian conflict wasn't just a conflict between one guerrilla warfare group and the state. It's far more complex than that. And the current government, elected in 2018, belongs to a party which is against the peace agreement and which has set up a number of obstacles for its implementation. It should be also pointed out that violence supported by drug trafficking is still imposing its law in various areas of Colombia. And more than 300 former guerrilla fighters have been assassinated since 2016. Massacres continue to be seen, internal displacement and the assassination of several leaders. But in spite of these problems, the peace agreement and the peace process more generally have started to transform the country. We are seeing a new generation of young people calling for peace and new politicians with new policies. There have been elections organized, which will take place next week. More than 10,000 former guerrilla fighters have given up their arms, and there are far fewer deaths than there were back 20 years ago. So the proof of that is that we can have this discussion today.
2008, porque esta película es muy...
Let's begin with 2008. It's a very strong film, and the events there took place in 2008. And I imagine everyone here is wondering what Rodrigo Londoño thinks about this film. Could you just describe your feelings in reaction to this film? What was life like in 2008, and where were you at that time?
Muy buenas noches para todas y para todos.
Good evening, everybody.
Un privilegio y un honor estar en este
It's a
escenario.
privilege and an honor for me to be here on this panel with Sergio Jaramillo,
Presidente Santos pues lideró
who on behalf of President Santos led the governmental commission that led to the peace agreement in Havana.
pero mucho más orgulloso y me
I'm
siento
also very proud to be here with Berta Lucia Frias, who was a victim, and not just any victim,
en Colombia,
of the Colombian
víctima
conflict.
de las acciones irracionales
A victim of irrational behavior that takes place during warfare.
y digo muy especial
And I'm saying she's a very special victim, because since then she has led a
no es posible
process that is essential to building peace, a process of reconciliation designed to try to heal those wounds, those very deep wounds that the conflict has left in Colombia.
que realmente la sane.
And we are determined to move on from there. And that's why, talking about President Santos and
Sí dije-
Dr. Jaramillo is really representing that side of the debate.
Si no hay
I think it wouldn't be a complete discussion if we didn't have someone here representing the victims.
bueno, ver esta película
Well, it is a work of art, this film, and like any work of art, some people will see it one way and others will see it very differently. And the first reaction I have is to remember what it was like during the war. And it was irrational. Things happened that should never have happened.
yo ingresé de 17 años a las FARC
And in the FARC,
soñando
I dreamed, I
no solamente soñando sino que lo hicimos allá
fought for what I believed was a future, a fairer, a country, a new country. And then finally, when I signed the peace agreement on behalf of the FARC with that same dream, still motivated me. And for the past 5 years, we've been working for that dream still.
yo creo que recordar sentir estas sensaciones
Remembering those very difficult feelings that we had when we were part of the guerrilla warfare,
en que ese no es el camino.
I think convinces us that that was not the right way.
Logramos sentar las bases
We
para iniciar un camino
managed to set the basis for a different way to try and pursue that dream,
a los colombianos.
committing ourselves to a better future for Colombians.
Afortunadamente, el primer gobierno
Unfortunately, the first of the three governments who we have seen trying to implement that agreement,
desafortunadamente pues llegó a la presidencia de Colombia
unfortunately,
a nombre de un partido que levantó como
a
bandera
party arrived in government who
Yo
was
recuerdo-
determined not to implement that agreement correctly. And I remember
sobre el tema que iban a hacer los acuerdos que yo que iba a decir. Yo dije,
what I was going to
vamos a
say.
mover cada pedacito
I'm trying to remember each
y lo volveremos a armar.
piece of that agreement.
Vamos
Y-
a seguir en 2008 para empezar y después...
Let's go back to 2008. And
2008.
okay, back in 2008.
Un año sumamente duro ya.
It was a very difficult year, of course, for all of us.
2008 muere
because
de forma natural nuestro jefe, Manuel Marulanda,
chief, Manuel Andes, died of natural causes. He was our leader. He was our reference. And so it was very difficult for us when he passed away.
seguimos.
But we did manage to continue the fight.
La muerte de Raúl Reyes,
But then Raúl Reyes also died when he was in Ecuador,
buscando cómo resolver el tema de los
trying to resolve that issue of the exchange of prisoners, the humanitarian exchange of prisoners, and try to set the process of dialogue in place.
no quiero
Unfortunately, that was never possible.
a juicios. La historia, yo espero que la historia lo diga.
I think history will tell that the Colombian state acted atrociously in the face of these people who
Y llevó
were trying to set in process that dialogue. And
a centenares
he was a real martyr for so many people who for
condiciones infrahumanas.
so many years had been living in such unhuman conditions. Unfortunately, that happened. So I think we should remember what an atrocious decision that was.
No, fue un desacierto sumamente grande
What a terrible mistake it was.
en medio de la construcción
And
de la paz.
we are trying to now recover from that in this peace-building process. So, Rodrigo, I think that was very important, what you had to say there, but we'll come back to that in a moment. I do think, though, at this point,
Hay una jurisdicción especial de la paz,
there is a special peace tribunal now in Colombia.
justicia sobre
A
lo
number of cases have been brought to justice regarding cases during the conflict, and one of those cases are those people who were abducted during the conflict. And some of the commanders have recognized those crimes, and I think that's a great step forward. Sergio, back in 2008, you were vice or deputy defense minister, and so it was a very intense year for the Colombian government. People had been abducted. There was the military operation against Raúl Reyes. There was also the military operation to rescue Ingrid Betancourt
los secuestrados.
and other
Y también estalló un escándalo,
kidnapped people. And then there was a scandal in Colombia, and that was
los falsos positivos, que
the
era
false positives scandal,
porque
which was really
son
a
civiles
crime. Those civilians who were killed by military officers.
les hacían pasar por guerrilleros
And
muertos
then
en
they tried to
combates.
pretend that they were guerrilla warfare fighters who had been killed in combat,
Entre comillas, de la guerra. Y hoy en día
to try
también
to improve their figures, if you like, in the war, the data. But now this special tribunal has investigated that, and apparently there were 6,000 people murdered by the state, and 1,500 military officials involved in that, soldiers involved. So 2008, how do you see that looking back?
Me uno al saludo a todos, a mis compañeros acá,
Well, I'd just like to extend my greetings to my colleagues here,
a Timo o
say
Rodrigo,
how good it is to see them again.
llamado en la vida civil. No, yo quisiera primero felicitar
And I'd just like to say that I'd like to congratulate the makers of this film, because it was an excellent film.
Yo conocí bien esa historia y
I knew this story very well myself, and I think it's very realistic, because the President Santos at that time was Minister of the Defense, and I was one of his deputy ministers.
lo que pasó ahí.
I know what happened, and perhaps better than anyone else in the government, I knew all of that story about the computers, and it really brought back a lot of memories for me.
Sobre todo, además de sentir que esa fue la realidad,
So yes, it's realistic,
que todo esto se haya acabado.
but thank God it's over.
Recuerdo muy nítidamente de esa época
And what I remember from that time, very clearly,
una conversación que tuve en ese mismo año
is a conversation that I had in 2008 with a journalist friend. And I said, I think the war is coming to an end, but we don't exactly know how to end it.
Y digamos, el golpe, a mi juicio,
And in my view,
genial y no suficientemente reconocido,
what was really tremendous and what hasn't been recognized enough in Colombia is when President Santos won the elections 2 years later, he realized that that was the right time to start to open up different channels, new channels, and try to build a process of exchange that led to negotiation.
También vamos a hablar de eso, ¿no? Y Berta, yo imagino que...
And that wasn't recognized enough, in my opinion.
Entonces,
Berta,
pero después usted ya empezó a...
in 2008, I imagine that you were trying to recover from the attack. It must have been really difficult.
presidente de Colombia y empezó también
In 2008, Santos was elected president, and one of the first things he did was to recognize the conflict, because before that, the Colombian state didn't recognize the existence of the conflict, and by recognizing the conflict, he recognized indirectly the victims.
Público, yo soy víctima, como lo mencionó Anne.
Well, before we start talking about 2008, the first thing I want to explain to the audience here is that I've been one of the victims of the largest urban attack that took place in Bogota and that endangered the entire country.
O se reúnen actualmente.
It was an attack by the FARC on a club called El Nogal. It's a very famous club where everyone meets from the political sphere, even high-ranking magistrates.
Están hablando del 2003 con el tema de.
When I watched the film, we talk about 2003 and Raúl Reyes. So that's March 2003, and the attack happened in February 2003. So
Yo estoy incapacitada. A mí me ha caído una pared.
you can see in the film, Raúl is in the jungle and
Oklahoma, más o menos. Ese era el.
I'm disabled.
Esa pared de encima.
It's like a wall of brick fell on top of me. The bomb was similar to the bomb used in the Oklahoma bombing.
Superior con la inferior se estaba desconectando y yo quedé
My
solamente.
vertebrae were damaged, and if you're not familiar with anatomy, that means that the upper part of my body wasn't connected to the lower part of my body. That means that it seemed that I wouldn't be able to walk again. I couldn't even move my fingers.
Eso fue lo
You know, it wasn't just a scratch. So that's the first thing.
incapacitada, en donde mi
So Raúl Reyes is in the jungle, and there I am,
y mi profesor
paralyzed, handicapped. My son cannot go to university because I can't pay for his studies. My husband, who is a professor at Harvard, needs to come to Colombia and take care of me.
y estoy en una situación en donde dos profesionales con varios títulos universitarios de la noche a la mañana se nos acabó la vida.
So I went to the US,
Hay que organizar este cuerpo.
and our life was just put to a halt. But still, we had to get organized because I couldn't even brush my own hair. I couldn't brush my teeth. I couldn't walk. And I can't tell you how much hatred I felt back then. And I'm not ashamed of saying so, because hatred can be a pleasant feeling in certain circumstances.
Rodrigo le digo Timo, y Timo le dice,
And this is something that you can see in the film as well. Rodrigo,
pero yo le,
que era Timochenko.
y yo le digo Timo.
who is here,
Entonces, ¿en qué estaba en el 2008? Yo duré 8 años y medio incapacitada.
used to have another name, go by another name. So in 2008,
Y en ese instante, yo siempre digo,
I was in a wheelchair and I used to feel so much hatred. And I used to say, if only I had a knife or even a fork, I would have used it. And I would have killed myself because I was completely useless. Because my son couldn't do anything. He was in the US. He didn't have documents. He was trying to make ends meet because we didn't have any money. From one day to the next, we didn't have any money anymore. You know, people say that people who used to go to Nogel and who were victims were very privileged. And it's important for the international community to know that, yes, the FARC placed the bomb, but you also need to know that the state was extremely responsible. And this is something that we need to say loud and clear. I do not accept, and I will not ever accept, violent acts such as those of the FARC. I've met Rodrigo several times, and these attacks, these acts are not actions I can condone.
Emocionante salir de este odio y empezar a trabajar.
So after all this, how did you get away from your hatred? How have you started working with other parties?
Colombia, yo tenía que andar.
Well, that wasn't in 2008 for sure, because I recovered only in 2012, and that's when I went back to Colombia. I could walk.
Organizacional y de
That's when I started walking again. Before that, I wasn't able to walk. I used to work in consulting, and I wanted to understand why people in Colombia joined illegal groups such as the paramilitary. So I started looking into this, and I conducted interviews.
Una víctima, y siempre lo digo, ¿qué le diría
They
usted?
didn't know I was a victim. I used to ask them, what would you tell one of your victims? I used to ask all of them the same question. And they all told me I would say sorry. I would ask for forgiveness. And that was quite magical for me, because I could feel that these people were asking for forgiveness, and they didn't know I was a victim. And that was a very, very strong moment in my life.
Escuchen mi historia. Y cuando yo escucho la historia de que
And I also wanted them to hear my story. So when I heard them say that they joined these armed forces because they didn't have any other alternative in their life, they had no money or no food or no place to live.
metiéndose en la guerrilla,
Maybe they are one amongst 8 or 9 siblings, and it's easier for them to join the guerrilla.
la inequidad.
Some are also ideologists. They're convinced of the righteousness of the cause. They want to fight inequality. And in 2012, I started talking about reconciliation and working on that topic. I started working with victims because I was a victim, as I told you, and I felt I could understand the victims.
Que es como los médicos, hay médicos acá, hay patrones que se repiten. Y a mí el hecho de encontrar patrones comunes me ayudó mucho.
And you know, there are patterns behind all of that.
Y
And that helped me understand how to work on reconciliation. I could see these patterns.
organizacional, cómo traer esas metodologías organizacionales. Y
I wanted to draw a methodology and put it at the service of peace, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Si seguimos, Sergio, de pronto, Rodrigo, ¿quieres o Sergio?
Do any of you want to react to what Berta said, or do you want to tell us about what happened next?
Empezó el gobierno,
So in 2012,
después que había que conversar con la guerrilla y como
that's when the government first got in contact with the guerrilla. That's when they started recognizing there was a conflict. So, as a reminder, there were 3 negotiation attempts
al iniciar una nueva negociación porque
that were unsuccessful. So the government was very much afraid of launching new negotiation and fail again. Because if the negotiations failed, then no one in Colombia would ever be able to trust anyone again. So we decided to go about things differently. We drafted a step-by-step strategy, just as if we were building a house.
junto con Timo, que era Pablo Catatumbo, ellos dos nos mandaban a través de este canal un
We used a communication channel with the main commander and his second command. I was in contact with them, and I used to relay their message to the president.
extraordinariamente difícil de hacer.
And we started thinking, trying to find ways to organize a meeting
La confidencialidad
between the 2 parties. Of course, we were extremely serious about security and confidentiality. So that meant no emails, no text messages. That meant that a person needed to come to Bogota, travel all the way to Bogota, get a memorandum, go back to Cali, get on their jeep, go all the way to the jungle, give the note to the person in charge there. You can imagine how long that took.
como era la
Sometimes we could wait a whole month for an answer.
era obvia
So, Rodrigo, you
en estas conversaciones.
were at the receiving end of these notes. How was trust established? Well, before I answer this question, I would like to react to what Berta just said.
Una serie de víctimas a conversar allá con los negociadores.
In Havana, during the peace process, we decided that some of the victims had to play a role in the peace talks. I wasn't a member of the negotiation commission, but I was very happy to be informed of this. And this is when I heard about Berta. I hadn't met her before that. We met at a meeting at the Technical University, and I remember
Pues todo lo que ha sido
the shock it felt for me when she started
como que la tierra
telling us in great detail what she'd been through. And I didn't even know where to hide. I was so ashamed. I was so ashamed
llamémoslo amistad,
to be faced with the consequences of our actions. And we ended up becoming friends, yes, friends. And we met several times after that in the peace-building process. And to react to what Dr. Jaramillo was saying, the negotiations that took place in El Gawan that failed, they failed because there was no real dialogue, no political dialogue.
Para continuar con sus ideales en el marco ya de las reglas del juego.
The government was asking us to lay down our weapons, and that would be it. President Santos understood that he would have to open political space for us.
Eran cartas razones, llamaba eso, que recibía Alfonso, nos lo comunicaba a nosotros y así.
So we used to receive these letters that you mentioned, and we used to have a system, radio communication systems with codes,
de nuestro planteamiento.
and that's what we used for communication. And then President Santos started hearing us. He recognized the fact that we were fighting for more justice. And that was the first time that we felt that there was someone in charge of Colombia who was ready to talk with us and who was aware of the political motives behind our actions.
Nosotros pusimos realmente solamente tres condiciones.
We set 3 conditions, and that is that any meeting had to be abroad, direct and secret. And what took a long time was setting the safety and security conditions for those meetings. And as you saw in this film, that wasn't an easy thing, and FARC were obviously afraid of the possibility of putting themselves at risk. And so we agreed that it would be in Cuba, and then we agreed that it would be with the support of the International Committee for the Red Cross. And I'd like to take advantage of that. We're here in Geneva to thank the ICRC, because without the ICRC, this peace process in Colombia wouldn't have been possible, because they went far beyond the call of duty. And instead of just doing humanitarian work, they went much further than that. They were the travel agents of the peace process. They sent Red Cross helicopters to pick up people from FARC people in the jungle and take them to Havana. And that's what made the negotiation possible. And Cuba and Norway also played very important roles. I was in Bogota at that time, and I saw colleagues from the ICRC who were opposite where I lived. And they said, and I said to them one day when I saw them, "Shall we see each other tonight?" And they said, "No, I've got to go to Havana." And now I know why. No, this was public. This wasn't public, rather. This was so secret that not even our commanders in that area knew what was going on, and when they went to get them, Mauricio, when they went to pick them up in the
y ahí nos encontramos en La Habana
at that
por
time.
primera vez.
So we met in Havana, the first time in a house, a very large house in Havana.
Y como de Batista, y como en una,
A family member of Batista, I think, owned the house, and like in a Cold War film, we were sat around a table in this old house, talking, and then these
construir lo que se llamó el acuerdo general, que fue el acuerdo marco.
Chalkboards started coming up, and we started noting things down, and that was the start of the process. So then public negotiations began. That's right.
Las FARC, por su lado,
FARC had to go back and talk about this, and the government had to talk about it as well. The initial question was how to build trust, and that's such an important thing. And you can only do that with showing honest behavior during that period. And obviously, Colombia was very much in the press, in the media, and we needed to show that we meant business and that we were honest brokers. And so we had to do what we were promising to do. And when we started to do that, we started, each of us, believing that we could build an agreement. In 3 years, we didn't achieve anything in the negotiations. And then, in just 5 months, we had a roadmap, a 5-page roadmap, I think a very good one. So things started to work, because each side saw that the other meant business, and there was optimism created. So the government and the FARC then had to convince civil society, businessmen, everyone else in a country that had been through so much. And obviously that wasn't an easy thing. There had been so many deaths, so much violence, and in the FARC, so many people had been in the jungle for so many years. How did you convince your people that it was time for peace? That was also a major challenge. Well, it wasn't too much of a challenge, because at the end of the day, it was part of our strategy. We, in 1982, carried out our 7th conference that decided upon a plan to take power. And the backbone of that was that we had to have Colombians' support. But we also established a strategy with a possible political outcome. When we saw that Rosario Betancourt was going to be elected. That's what we thought was going to happen. But then we came back with this ideal of a political solution. Of course, it may seem contradictory, but what was very, very difficult was that we started the process with Alfonso Cano, and I was the head of the negotiating delegation in Havana. And Alfonso Cano, I'm sorry for saying this, was then assassinated in the middle of those discussions. And I've said this to President Santos on a number of occasions as well. This was a very difficult blow for the negotiations. And then a discussion took place, but no one opposed what we were doing. Of course, it's difficult to continue negotiating when Alfonso Cano had just been killed. But nevertheless, we realized that this was part of our strategy, and that's why we needed to continue with the negotiations, even though we were just starting them. Of course, it was a challenge. It was a difficult time. But we were starting out on a process, and we had to be clear. If we didn't make the most of this opportunity, then we didn't know how long the war was going to go on before we get another chance. Of course, after of course, the war was going on, and in order to start negotiations, we had to have a ceasefire. That was one thing that you wanted to see. Yes, it was an important rule that we set out, and that was that from the first contacts we had, the understanding was that in the meantime, hostilities were continuing, and the war was ongoing, and we were trying to resolve it. And we said, when there was this operation, from our point of view, we hadn't even sat down to negotiate yet. And when we did sit down to negotiate, we set an additional rule, and that is that we weren't going to discuss what was going on in the battlefield, nor what had happened in the past, because we weren't here to try and attach blame. We were there to try to resolve the problem. And that, I think, avoided a lot of the animosity which tends to crop up when people have these wounds still open. And we just said, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to blame each other. We're trying to resolve this issue.
El proceso de paz
Well, of course, the Colombian peace process is a very long story, and we don't have time to talk about all of the details. But let's move on to 2016, when there was a ceasefire in place and a first peace agreement. Could I just suggest something? What happened is that we negotiated a framework agreement, and the president announced that the peace process would begin on the basis of that roadmap
Una agenda con 6 puntos.
with 6 key points. And the country knew that was going on,
Secreto,
and
había
all of
un
it had been negotiated in secret. So what was going to be very challenging was to try and get people on board. And perhaps we didn't do that enough, and that's why we paid a price for that later on, because it wasn't participatory enough. But we negotiated point by point. We started with the rural issues, and then we asked the UN and the National University to organize a conference in Colombia
tener opiniones de la gente
to
sobre
try to hear what people thought about that. And then we moved on to the next thing about political participation, and then the next thing, which was drugs. And when we got to the issue of victims,
Eso hay que hacer estas mismas conferencias en Colombia,
we
pero eso no va.
realized there had to be conferences in Colombia, but we realized that wasn't going to be enough. Because victims, and I'm not just being rhetorical here, were or had to be a key part of these negotiations. There was a victims' law for administrative reparations, which was approved prior to the negotiations, actually.
Aquí hay que hacer algo
And
distinto.
we said we had to go further.
Luego decir,
And I
oiga,
was talking with the
¿por qué no
Norwegian
pensamos
envoy about this.
en tener un grupo
I
acá
said,
realmente
well, we
representativo?
get some representative of the victims to participate. And the government and the FARC agreed
Tenían que ser víctimas de
that
todos.
they had to be victims from all sides. And the UN and the church and the university had to choose those victims. 60 victims divided into 5 different delegations.
Tú nos cuentes, Berta, pero
And now that Berta can tell us a little bit more about that. I think it was a very great thing, because it was like a sort of truth commission within the negotiation process, and it was in Havana. We all heard from those victims, and it was very memorable, because we spent a whole morning listening to them. And
El conflicto colombiano hizo
according to the government, there were about 9 million victims in the Colombian conflict,
gente
200,000 deaths, many more displaced. So many victims. Berta, tell us a bit about that when you went to Havana.
Y gracias por
Thank you for giving me the floor once again, Sergio. Thank you for what you've said. And I forgot to mention something earlier on, and I was saying that the state was also responsible for this attack, because it was a very challenging time, and in such a time, public officials shouldn't organize meeting that put civilians in danger. And El Nogal is a very important spot, as I was saying, but it's where a lot of ministers come. Even President Uribe held meetings there. So that put people in danger. That's what I was saying. And I started looking into that. And I started investigating it. And the government didn't like the fact that I was investigating. And as a victim, I was then threatened because I was investigating and trying to look into what was going on in El Nogal Club. 2 ministers were holding meetings there. The Minister of Defense would sleep there. And then I was threatened because I was trying to look for the truth, and I was trying to denounce that situation. Now, coming back now to the peace process and the fact that the victims were involved. That was so important because the process leading to the peace agreement, the fact that I was denouncing what was going on in El Nogal, I was really trying to understand why FARC bombed that place. And I was trying to defend the peace agreement at that same time.
Y el plebiscito,
And the elections took place, and the president said, look, they put the peace agreement to the people, and we lost. The people did not support the agreement at that time. And for me, it seemed so absurd for that to happen. But when that vote took place, just afterwards, the FARC contacted me. They wrote to me, and they invited me to Havana. Not with the group of victims, but afterwards. I was invited personally, and I didn't know people in the FARC. I learned to try to understand why, but philosophically, I was starting to understand that reconciliation was collective. It was very difficult for me to pardon, but reconciliation was something else. We had to look into a new peace agreement then, because of the fact that this vote had been lost. And some changes had to be made. I'm just going to explain that in September 2016, in Cartagena, a peace agreement was signed between, or in the presence of the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, and dozens of ambassadors, thousands of journalists. And there was a peace ceremony took place there. That was on the 26th of September. And then at the beginning of October, a vote took place, a referendum on peace. And of course, there were a lot of fears expressed, and a very strong campaign took place. It was a bit like Brexit campaign or something, but a very, very violent one. And the vote took place, and the peace agreement was rejected. And many of the people involved very bravely went back to the negotiating table. After such a difficult process leading to a 300-page agreement that was rejected, it was very brave of the negotiators to go back to the negotiating table. So that's when you went to Havana. That's right. And when they said, when they asked me to come to Havana, I said, the only condition I would set is that you tell me the truth about what happened in El Nogal and why you killed 36 people. That is the condition, and then I will come. And I said that on that basis, we can try and build some process for reconciliation.
Dígale cualquier cosa, véngase rapidito y...
Okay, they said. When I went to Havana, I met, I was in a room and I was the only victim. And I met with the FARC. And I had to explain what I felt. It was a very difficult situation for them. Very uncomfortable. And I ended up sitting for a whole day in Ivan Marquez's house. He was a dissident from FARC. And I said to Ivan Marquez,
voy a tener que ser mi propio laboratorio de lo que yo he enseñado en las
I said, look, I'm going to try out what I was teaching for people for so long about how to overcome difficult situations. I was going to be my own guinea pig and try. And emerged from this, when I met Ivan Marquez, we talked about the dog, we talked about various things, but I never said, why did you put that bomb in El Nogal? I was calm. I tried to stay calm. And Ivan Marquez said, yep. I accepted the blame, and I said, I'm not going back to Colombia, and I'm not going to go back and say what you just told me. I'm not going to go back and say this myself. You are going to have to accept the blame publicly. And then we reached an agreement among the victims of Anagal. I represent a victims group. We agreed on an agreement between victims and FARC. And it's the only agreement signed by the FARC and by the victims. And there were 7 points to that agreement. 5 years have passed since that was signed. It was back in November 2016. And one of the points in that agreement was basically how the El Nogal victims were going to meet the FARC. And that was really the starting point. And it took me into a whole new world of trying to prepare those victims for that meeting with people from the FARC. Of course, it was challenging because we're talking about 5 years ago, and victims just said, no, how do you expect me to go and meet people from the FARC? They killed my mother, they killed my husband, they destroyed my life. And some of them didn't want to go. Some of them refused. But I think this was really, really important, the fact that we did go. And victims got up and explained to the FARC what it was like for them. And we just tried to make sure that they weren't going to go over there and attack those people from the FARC. Because some of them said, look, I'm just going to kill them when I see them. And I said, look, no, that's not possible. We can't go about things that way. This is a peace tribunal. So it was very difficult to try and get people to understand that, because they would just end up in prison if they tried to do that. So the victims went in, and the FARC were in front of them, and we told them. I think a lot of people cried. I don't think I've ever cried as much, and many of the victims were crying. It was a very emotional occasion. But I could see the people from the FARC sinking into their seats the more we spoke. I could see their reaction. One of them got up and said, after 13 years, we recognize that, yes, we put that bomb in El Nogal. And for us, that was very important, the fact that they recognized that. Because we just want to know the truth. And I think that was a very important occasion. And then just one more thing. After lunch, I said to the victims, we're going to have round tables to discuss these issues, and we're going to set up these different tables, and we're going to mix together victims with people from the FARC. And the victims looked at me like I was crazy. They said, how can you expect me to sit down next to someone who has destroyed my life? And then they did, and they sat down with each other, and they talked about things in the jungle, they talked about things, and I could hear people laughing together, and that was key, because they started talking about values and the type of behavior you need for reconciliation. And at the end of the day, all of those involved, and I mean all of those,
Todos dijeron, he perdonado.
had
Todos dijeron,
reached a stage where they could pardon the others, because they'd seen the human side of those people from the FARC. Of course, they didn't try and justify it, and we learned that. We learned that we were all in the same boat, and the FARC gave gifts to the victims,
eso lo vamos a esconder, no le vamos a contar.
and it was such a success. We had a photo, a group photo at the end. It was almost like we just won the World Cup. There was celebration, but it was the World Cup of reconciliation. It was such a wonderful occasion that victims who didn't go called me and said, why can't you organize another meeting like that so I can go? And we did 3 of them. And the last one, the Truth Commission was invited, a delegate from the Norwegian embassy came, from the Cuban embassy, the High Commissioner, the FARC people as well came. So just to explain that, basically, that is what made us realize that reconciliation was possible.
Amenazada porque un sector de la sociedad de mi país
And part of the Colombian society still couldn't accept that I had went to meet with the FARC, and that's when I started to receive even more threats, and that's why I had to be guarded. And unfortunately, you know, that's the type of contradiction that we see in Colombia that you may not understand.
Well, that's how it went about in Colombia. The government used to negotiate with the FARC, but no one could stand the fact that I would meet them. Should we now give the floor to the audience?
Con una comisión de verdad, con un tribunal de paz, con una unidad de búsqueda para los desaparecidos.
There's a peace tribunal, a peace court that has been created through the peace accord, a reparation mechanism, which is very important for the FARC, for the victims, and for the armed forces. And little by little, despite of the difficulties, and currently the situation is particularly complex again, there's a lot of violence in some regions. Social leaders who are being murdered. But I think it's time to hear from the audience. Let's take questions from the audience. Thank you. My name is Ricardo Espinosa. I'm Colombian. Thank you, for everything you've been doing for peace in Colombia. I would have liked that the government be represented on this panel, maybe the Colombian mission.
Durante ese proceso de la guerra que se muestra en la película.
You're talking about the victims, those who've lost their lives in this process. As we've seen in the film, during this war, there was also a dirty war. You're talking about false positives. It's one of the dirtiest wars that humanity has ever known. 6,412 people have been slaughtered by the military, and this is something that the state has never recognized. The Patriotic Union is fighting not to recognize its own responsibility. And as the government is not represented here, please do tell us who is responsible for these murders, these 6,412 dead. All of them were innocent, none of them were guerrilleros. Who was in charge back then? They knew, they all knew. And until today, no one is speaking up for them. Who is responsible for that? Please, tell us the truth. And Rodrigo, tell us what you think of all that. Sergio, tell us.
Contestar yo creo cada pregunta, ¿no? O sí, me parece mejor.
En Colombia están pasando unas cosas que los mismos
In Colombia,
no solo para
there are things that happen that even the Colombians themselves do not understand, and they do not understand how important they are for the country and the reconciliation process. We have tried to put in place a holistic justice and reparation process, including finding the missing persons and setting up a tribunal for peace.
de lo habitual que las personas reconozcan su responsabilidad. Entonces, lo que ha ocurrido en Colombia, que fuerza guerrilla.
In a trial, the sentence needs to be lighter for those who recognize their crimes. And in Colombia, for the first time,
Y alguien se puede preguntar,
guerrilla forces have surrendered and accepted to go to court and recognize the fact that they've committed war crimes and crimes against humanity.
para garantizar
And that was made possible through this process, which was very clear and which provided for
en Colombia no ha pasado en ninguna otra parte.
all crimes to be investigated. And this is something that has never existed in any other country.
De la verdad de Sudáfrica, pero a la
You all know the Commission for Truth in South Africa with the end of apartheid,
están yendo no solamente soldados,
but never were state agents, state forces to recognize their crimes. In Colombia, in December, a general was charged with
ese proceso va andando.
being involved in these false positives, and he recognized his responsibility on the matter. And this whole process is still ongoing. We still have a long way to go. And it is hard for me to say as well. And as a vice minister, back then, I started internal investigations on these terrible events. And so we conducted this internal investigation, and we've managed to put an end to these practices. But it was a very painful process. It's very difficult for me to come back on this. Well, for myself, I'd like to remind you that the peace process is still ongoing, still under construction. We started it 5 years ago. And in the international community, some think that that's it, it's all done. There's peace in Colombia. We've wasted about 4 years with President Rodrigo.
En las elecciones pasadas nos reunimos al final del control.
And during the most recent elections,
Este resultado era fruto del acuerdo de paz. Y esta posibilidad de que los colombianos elijamos un Congreso que mayoritariamente...
After the most recent elections, the president-elect recognized the fact that he had been elected thanks to this very peace process. So he gave it a new impetus, but some parts of society cannot stand the fact that the Colombian people are trying to build a fair, more equal society. This is why we need the support of the international community. Under Belisario Betancourt, we also had opportunities, but everyone's so scared. The oligarchs and all the people in power are so afraid of change in society. They were afraid that such deep reforms would take place that they started with this dirty war again and all these paramilitary activities. So while I'm on this panel, I have to tell you that this process has been extremely important, because without reconciliation, without everything that we've done with Berta and the others, we wouldn't have been able to heal our wounds.
A mí me parece que
It's important to recognize our own responsibilities and stop placing the blame. There's something I would like to add to that. First, thank you for your question,
hay cosas que fueron
and thank you for giving me the floor.
en el país. Por eso
It is true
debe ser
that we have witnessed horrible, horrible things in our country. This is why reconciliation in and of itself is a complete change of paradigm in our country.
porque se parqueó mal, porque lo hizo
The society is violent. You know,
llamado.
on the road, within families, there is a lot of violence.
Hay que cambiar.
And for a number of years, I've been working on something which is creating a reconciliation and a social cohesion ministry. We need a change in paradigm. Recently, I was working with young people, and I was asking them, how can we build a human being who can take others into account? And these young people were telling me, that's impossible in Colombia, we'll never get there. And I told them, well, I've worked with
Era una utopía.
the FARC, and we've managed to sit around a table, and we've managed to find ground for reconciliation. You know, before we walked on the moon, there used to be just a dream, and a few years back, we didn't have mobile phones either. So what we need to do is to sit around the table and talk about this, talk about things. We need to gauge what victims feel and take the time to allow them to open up to others. Because hatred lives in our bodies. It lives in our bodies, but not only because of what we've been through, but also because our parents have taught us hatred, because political parties have taught us hatred. Of course, we need to work with the victims, but you need to work with the FARC as well. For example, when we met, I had to sit
Le pasó una bala por toda la cara.
right in front of them.
torturada, no tiene nariz, no tiene aquí un turupe en la cabeza, no tiene dientes, no tiene mentón.
No, there was this victim who lost half of his face. He feels he looks like a monster. And I told Timo, this one needs a special treatment. So, together, we gave some thought to how we could listen to his story. We created a small group to work on his specific issues. You know, it's interesting. The world is more interested in war than in reconciliation. War sells, you know. You see the pictures of war in Ukraine with the Russian invasion.
Y no entiendo cómo la diplomacia aceptó llegar a esta guerra.
Showing pictures of the signature of a peace agreement, it also looks very good. But how can you show what reconciliation actually looks like? We've been working for 12 years on creating a society based on dialogue. And it's not just a dialogue between two people. No, it's dialogue. It's about empathy. It's about opening your hearts, not just your ears, your heart. And I'm almost done.
Hay que generar reconciliación ya. Y ahí es donde yo pienso que es.
This festival needs to convey a message for Ukraine and Russia. We need to prepare reconciliation with the civil society, the diplomats, academia. Everyone needs to sit down and talk and not leave the negotiating table until it is all over. The victims need to be able to leave the negotiating table feeling that they can forgive. And forgiveness is the whole process. There's nothing mechanical about it. Well, one thing I'd like to say here is that violence is not specifically Colombian. All wars are dirty, and Colombians like to say that there's a lot of violence in their country, but in all wars, violent things happen. So this is why it is so important to work on reconciliation. One quick question, first of all. Thank you for everything that you've done. You've helped us get a taste of peace. I'm from Colombia. I voted for peace. I cried back then, and now, 5.5 years later, I have to say I'm concerned for this Commission for Truth, because its term is coming to an end and we don't know what to do about it. I'm concerned because now there are even doubts on who are the victims. We need to work on truth. We need to know what Colombia will be doing in the next steps, because the peace accords are still quite incomplete. We need to work on the paramilitary, the ELN, and reconciliation, both for the victims and for the country at large. The peace accords are still incomplete. So, how long will it still take? We need to be able to move forward, but the Commission for Truth is working with the drug traffickers and the paramilitary, and we've had 15 attacks in our countries. We are the country in which there are the most murders of environmentalists and human rights defenders. So what sort of hope can we have for the future? Well, there's an easy answer. We need to elect a better government. A government that would
Me da mucha vergüenza con ustedes que tan pacientemente nos han oído.
Really implement the accord.
Celebrando esta actitud que.
I know it is very late, and I'm sorry for you. You're all very patient. But I would like to conclude on this. I'm very happy to see Rodrigo's commitment. Of course, some things went right, others went wrong, but I think 5 years after the accords were signed,
y sin embargo el proceso sigue adelante, cada vez tiene más fuerza.
We've had 3 years under a government which was against the accord, and despite of that, the accord is getting stronger and stronger, and it is not as controversial as it used to be. So I wouldn't be surprised that we managed to elect a better government. Well, yes, we do need Congress and a president that would support the peace accords. The peace accords are not flawless, of course, but they are enshrined in the Constitution now, and civil servants need to swear an oath on the Constitution, so there you go. We also have legal instruments. You know, that's what we have in our hands. It's not a weapon, it's a political instrument. So we need to change. It's written in the Accords, so that should give us hope to be able to implement projects that bear fruit. And the other thing we need to do is we need to communicate, because 5.5 years, you know, there are students or even academics who are not aware of the meaning behind these accords, these 6 points. I'm not even mentioning the details here, but the main points of the accords. And we also need the support of the international community on that matter, because it was instrumental in this signature of these accords. Berta, do you want to say a few words of conclusion? Well, I agree with my colleagues here. In business, you know, you have to work on short, medium, and long term. Short term, that means elections, but medium and long term, we need to create a culture of reconciliation. And there's the question, how can we create public policy through which the state has a role to play, public policy that be cross-cutting through all sectors, so that we have reconciliation in all sectors of society? Because post-conflict times need a different type of human being. You can't just be thinking about yourself. You need to think medium and long term. You know, I don't have grandchildren yet, but I like to think what country I would like to leave them. And if we want to give them a different country, we need to create a different culture. And that means that I need to be aware of my own actions if we want to build a different country together. Thank you. Thank you.